Hello out there, world, and welcome to another edition of Blogging Heads TV. I'm James Poulos, the founding editor of the postmodern conservative blog at First Things.
And I am Robert Farley. I am an assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. So today, James, how is the weather where you are, by the way?
The weather is grim. Yesterday, the weather was beautiful. The weather was teasing 70 degrees. I was standing outside of my backyard painting a painting in my swim trunks and feeling great. And now it's dark and stormy and wet. You?
Well, actually, strikingly enough, I'm having exactly the same experience here. We, in fact, are in the middle of a thunderstorm right now. So for people who see flashes in the background, that is the thunder and the lightning. So. Yeah, that's what it is.
If you have any thunder snow, be sure to let the viewing audience know.
Well, it's 62 degrees, so we are unlikely to have thunder snow, but we'll see. So today we are talking about the article that has generated some buzz on American exceptionalism, and this was by Rich Lowry and Ramesh Ponnuru, and it was in the National Review. And did it come out a couple weeks ago? When did it come out exactly?
It came out not that long ago. I think a couple of weeks sounds about right. It's many people have taken exception to it, you might say.
Right.
The date that I'm seeing right here in front of me is March 8th, so maybe it came out even more recently than I remember.
Okay. It's fairly recent. It's earned a fair amount of attention so far. March 8th seems really recent, because Damon Linker wrote that really long piece about it. It wasn't super long, but it was fairly long.
No, okay, yeah, they posted it on March 8th on the website, so that explains that.
So, and you've blogged about it. I actually have been in the midst of other stuff, and so I hadn't actually read it until this afternoon when we said we were going to be blogging something on it. And so, I will start off by giving a one-sentence take of what I thought, and then that will produce a leading question, which since you've actually written on the article so far, I will then toss to you. So I read this and I found virtually nothing of value. You have a blog post about it that I think actually does try to derive something of value. And so I guess I'll toss to you, what did you find in this essay that was interesting and that you think is productive in terms of a discussion of the United States and the role of the United States in the world?
Well, right. I found a couple things. Maybe not the things that the authors would have wanted me to find, but on the other hand, maybe so. I mean, just speaking from sort of the point of greatest generality, the exceptional thing about this essay, to just keep beating this pun into the ground, is that it really does reaffirm, I think, the way in which American conservatism self-consciously rejects the kind of conservatism that traces its intellectual heritage in a sustained and deep-rooted way back to Europe. This is not even Burkean conservatism, right? This is conservatism that is red, white, and blue through and through. And I think
that's a rejection. I mean, it's basically a rejection of Europe, right? Right. That and everything that we see here is all of these wonderful things about the United States are essentially rejections of a European model, even as far back as 1776.
Well, I mean, now that I've said that, I will walk it back just a little bit to say that you do get a picture in here of at least a glimpse of the sort of intellectual tradition that a guy like Pocock traces out, which is civic republicanism in Italy, civic republicanism in England, civic republicanism in America. That thread of it, I think, is present. And Harrington, I think it's name checked somewhere in here. And so there is kind of a crypto Europe that emerges in the essay, but you really have to read between the lines to find it, which perhaps is too bad. Although on the other hand, who would really want to read an essay about how Italian republicanism of the Renaissance has shown forth, right, in this kind of quasi-Wilsonian Truman conservative world that we may or may not be living in.
Right. And so I mean, one of the things, this is was what I read specifically from you, and I think your comment went along the lines that there ought to be, and you took it in a very foreign policy direction, in a very almost liberal internationalist direction, and you spoke a little bit about how there is an exceptional moment, that exceptional moment, and correct me if I'm remembering or misremembering what exactly you wrote, but this exceptional moment is about generating a world in which the era of American exceptionalism has passed. Is that right, or am I misconceptualizing what you read?
That's the bumper sticker version.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, let me put it this way. I think that Lowry and Ponnuru are on pretty safe ground when they want to stake out a claim about the ways in which the United States, as kind of an empirical matter, are not like other countries. And then I think they're even on safe ground sort of connecting that sort of empirical claim to more normative claims about the set of duties that situation sets up for American leaders, right? So some of my friends on the right who are not internationalists or who aren't interventionists, to be sort of kinder to them, are close to saying, as George Will said about Afghanistan, look, we can just sort of roll everything up in a bag and fly away, and if we have to fire a cruise missile or two every once in a while or drop in a few commandos, then we can do that. But other than that, let's just back off. My claim would be it's too difficult to do that across the board in any meaningful way without sort of complicating not just our national security situation, but to speak in UN terms, the peace and security of the world as such, right? Now, I'm somewhat uncomfortable speaking in global security terms, right? I don't think that my argument is leading us toward a global cop redux kind of position. But I think what I am cautioning, and what I'm I don't know, I'm a little puzzled to see that no one else is making this argument as forcefully as I think it could be made. That there are demands that the United States faces that other countries simply don't face, and it's not like there's a receiver coalition or set of international institutions or organizations that could start to pick up those sorts of duties as we surrender them. It would be great if we were able to do that in certain cases, and we're not now. So what I'd like to see are some people on the right and the left doing a bit of intellectual heavy lifting or policy work to figure out how it is that we can extricate ourselves from what I think is more or less, and contra Lowry and Ponnuru, an unnatural position for the United States to be in.
Right. I mean, I guess my reaction to and it's interesting that I think you put it in a very value neutral way, especially compared to how Lowry and Ponnuru are thinking about American exceptionalism. Because when I was listening to you, I was simply thinking hegemonic stability theory. And hegemonic stability theory is interesting in that it posits that the hegemon is exceptional and that the hegemon does have an exceptional role to play in international affairs, that the hegemon does have, that hegemon is more powerful than other states, that hegemon can make certain things happen in the international system that other states cannot, that no countervailing coalition can do. But hegemonic stability theory is also sort of general, right? I mean, it says nothing about the particular characteristics of the hegemon that we're talking about. And I guess what I sort of just heard you say was not that America is exceptional qua America, right? That there, America is interesting, in that it's the most powerful state in the international system at this particular moment, and that particular position generates a set of responsibilities that we can even think of in a moral way. But I don't think that's really not how Lowry and Ponnuru are thinking about exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, right? I mean, they want to think about how America is just really radically different than other countries. And I think they want to think that separate from America's position in the world, that America is just intrinsically different for the variety of reasons that they set forth. And so I guess...
Well, right. I mean, I guess that my...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I agree with you. I'm a big fan of hegemonic stability theory, and I would go even farther and say that I'm a big fan of some of the more value-positive elements or aspects of hegemonic stability theory, which say that The hegemon does have certain responsibilities, and that the values of the hegemon do matter. But that argument seems really different than the argument that they're making.
Right, and this is where my critique gets a little bit meta, but I think it's an important point, so I'm gonna emphasize it, because their argument takes kind of two leaps. The first leap is America is an exceptional country in such and such a way, but the second part, and this is the part that I think has taken this piece beyond the level of a kind of foreign affairs-y kind of article. And into a partisan sort of camp that has generated the kind of reaction that it's generated, for good or for ill, which is any American leader, especially an American president, who doesn't recognize that this is the case and then act in a certain way when it comes to crafting his foreign policy, is derelict in some important way. Is failing to carry out the duties that are set before any American president today.
Right, and I mean, I think that's exactly why this has attracted a certain degree of partisan rhetoric, because, I mean, when I read this, what I read was an argument, and Ponnuru and Lowry, neither of them are really historians, and they have a very consensus-driven view of American political conflict, right? I mean, they don't have a very detailed discussion of any of the major serious conflicts in American politics. At the founding or since the founding. And their vision of what it means to be American is built on a particular conception of what this consensus meant, right? And so they have this discussion of labor politics. And they say, well, America's always hated labor unions, which is A, wrong, and B, the U.S. attitude, the attitude in the United States, the attitude of the federal government towards the labor movement and towards the union movement has been one that has been part of a bitter, vicious political fight in the United States. And that's a fight that has gone back and forth over history, especially over the last 100 years, sometimes with advocates of labor pushing forward, sometimes with advocates of business pushing forward and coming into the fore. But the specifically partisan element is that Ponnuru and Lowry suggest that one of these sides is on the side of American exceptionalism, and one of these sides is against American exceptionalism. And that is what makes this a particularly partisan piece, because it's about declaring a certain vision of American exceptionalism and declaring that those who oppose it, those who are on the other side of these mini debates about the role of the state in American life, are, and I hesitate to use this term, but I think it fits, that these people are un-American, that these people are against sort of the central thrust of American identity and against what makes America exceptional and unique. And so then we can then think about sort of strong advocates of labor who I think conceived of themselves as patriotic Americans. We can think of them in this context as being opposed to American exceptionalism, as in favor of America that is not exceptional. And I think that's why so many people are irritated by it, because it puts some Americans in the American category, and it puts some Americans in the not quite American category.
Well, and of course, some American conservatives who will insist, despite whatever Lowry and Ponnuru might claim, that they are not only Americans but conservatives, and American conservatives to boot. Right? Many of them might write for the American Conservative. Right. Who would go into the un-American category. So I recognize what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it, but I think the article reveals some of the challenges that mainstream conservatives face right now in sort of navigating or negotiating this fine line or this gray area between the sort of interventionism that you get out of Clinton Democrats on the one hand, or for that matter, Truman Democrats, and the sort of reticence or prudence-driven realism that you get out of guys like George Will, right? So that I think one thing that could be said well of Lowry and Ponnuru in this case is they're
Hello?
They are throwing themselves into an important debate in a way that that really does cause people to stop and reconsider where they fit along the spectrum. the spectrum happens to be changing in a way that I think is going to continue to frustrate the categories that we currently have.
Right.
But again, to return to their claim about presidential duties and what it is to be an American president and what it is to be an un-American president, I'd like to see a world in which presidents and presidential candidates who agree with Lowry and Ponnuru are considered to be within the mainstream of American political thought and are considered to be reasonable, despite holding this set of opinions that other people disagree with, but not indispensable, right? I mean, even if they're right, even if they're correct now that it is indispensable that we have a president who agrees with them, and that's a point that I might, at the end of the day, agree with them about. I don't think that that's a sort of a natural state for America to be in, for starters. And even beyond that, I don't think that it's a position that we should sort of envy ourselves for having. I think it's a position that it would be nice if we didn't have to go there, if we didn't have to keep that up. And I don't think there's anything un-American. Indeed, I'm inclined to sympathize with some of my paleo friends on this count, where they say, hey, we're going to be more American than ever if we dial some of this stuff back in certain ways. I think that's a pretty
one of the
a pedestrian point to make at the end of the day, but it seems to be one that carries a particular significance nowadays.
Right. I mean, I'm a professor of international relations, and I specialize in military doctrine, military policy, and so forth. And so one of the things that I was shaking my little fists in rage about while I was reading this essay was, and I guess I'll choose my words carefully, was the studied ignorance about the military history of the United States, the history of the relationship between civilian and military in the United States. Because to attempt to describe modern American military policy, this is in the context of the size of the Department of Defense, the size of military spending, and what's shocking is that they say that this is characteristically American, right? They suggest that it's characteristically American to have this large military establishment, to use it vigorously. You see, I know stuff about this, and prior to World War II, the United States had an uncharacteristically small military establishment, which the per capita spending in the United States on the military was not just dramatically, but dramatically lower than it was in France or the United Kingdom or in Germany. And what was striking and exceptional about the United States was not that we were a particularly militaristic nation, but that we were a particularly pacifistic nation. And this was mentioned repeatedly in discussions of the American polity in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and was also the source of bitter political conflict. And this is all gone. There's nothing there. There's no glimmer that there's any understanding of this in the Lowry and the Ponnuru. There's any understanding that there's a really substantial break in American foreign policy in 1945. Instead, they simply assume that the role that the United States began to play in 1945 is sort of a classically American exceptionalist role, when it would, in fact, it's much more intelligible in the context of this hegemonic role that something like the United Kingdom pursued during the 19th century. So almost completely not American exception, not exceptionally American. But instead, they describe this particular vision of the role of the military in American life as something that's characteristic of the American experience, which it's not, right? Which is an indefensible historical statement. And I found that agitating, as you can probably tell.
Well, right. I mean, there are a bunch of different stories that you can tell about how American militarism progressed and what shape it took. If I was trying to put together my version of their story, I think it could be done in a compelling way, but you've got to sort of do a different set of historical calisthenics to get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think you could tell a story that goes like this, right? Justice Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it, right? And then my take on the Civil War is probably a lot different than theirs. it wasn't, oh, those dirty, rotten Southerners, they bombed our fort, and now let's invade the entire South and occupy it militarily and break up the states into military districts and so on and so forth. Right. That's, not really. There's an interesting story to be told about how Southern military culture was imported into American military culture after the Civil War, right? And there's an interesting story to be told about how the Grand Army of the Republic, as soon as they finished emancipating the slaves, turned around and finished off the Indians, right? And there's an interesting story to be told about how sort of the Jacksonian domestic militarism and post-Civil War Manifest Destiny related militarism fed into a Republican Party that needed to exercise a certain kind of military might and practice a certain kind of expansionism in order to preserve, or really to create for itself, an identity that would hold it together. Arguably, the South was perfectly able to leave the United States of America and retain an identity that could hold it together. Whereas, Lincoln's concerned that if the South left, then the North would fragment into who knows how many little confederacies, I think, was well justified. Before the Civil War, the North had not much to hold it together. It had lots of immigrants and lots of merchants on the East Coast and people out in the hinterland, and I think that there's an important story to be told about the way that American expansionism in the 19th century and going into Teddy Roosevelt, and it's between Roosevelt and Wilson where we get, I think, a significant break. I think that story is one that could be told in a way that might ultimately reinforce Lowry and Ponnuru's points more than they might want it to.
Right. I mean, I guess I would agree. Yeah. The thing is, and this is the point. There are a lot of interesting stories that can be told about the exceptionalism of American foreign policy, and Lowry and Ponnuru are not interested in telling any of them. And this is one where I don't like to suggest motivation, because I don't think that very many of these very interesting stories about American exceptionalism could find their way into a cover article in the National Review. And I guess this is something that struck me again and again as I was reading this, that this is the article. The article is almost weighed down by its own aspirations of significance, by being to be its effort to be a profound statement of what exactly is wrong with Obama, about why exactly Obama is an un-American or anti-American president, and I guess as much as anything else, it was those aspirations and the sort of fudging and fuzziness and softness that those aspirations produced that irritated me about it as a piece both of scholarship and political rhetoric.
Well, right. So perhaps the question we're left with is the substantive critique of Obama able to stand on its own two legs, sort of after you clear away the rhetoric and the aesthetic surroundings that that people like you are unable to take at face value.
Right. Right. And I guess I didn't really see much left after that. I guess for me, in the end, it was all that atmospheric, which I find, again, obviously, I would find it of not much value, because I don't care about these things. I don't care about the things that the readers of the National Review care about, and so I'm not the intended audience, and so of course I would not take all these things too seriously. But it seems to me that what was left over was so minimal as to be trivial, as to be uninteresting and really unworthy of comment. And I say that in being part of what is now, I don't know, however many minute discussion of this article. I really didn't like the article. I guess maybe you can tell that. So,
I'm getting that sense. Yes.
Now, what do you? And a few they responded to some of these critiques in ways that I found pretty unsatisfying. But one of the particular critiques that we haven't mentioned tonight, but that they did make an effort to respond to, was this critique that somebody pointed out, or maybe they talked about Victor Davis Hanson explaining that America had never had sort of its feudal or serf class, and that this was one of the most important things about the American psyche. And then somebody pointed out, well, we did have slavery, and that's kind of important. And their response was, yeah, we had slavery, but it didn't turn out to be very important. Um, and I guess as much as anything else, really, slavery didn't turn out to be that important in the United States. Yeah, the thing that we fought this war over, that more Americans died in than any other war Americans have ever fought in. I think, in fact, more Americans died in that war than all the other wars combined that Americans have fought in. And that, I think even today, when slavery, the institution of slavery continues to characterize American politics in important ways, right? You can make all sorts of interesting correlations between voting patterns and the density of slave populations and so forth. And it was like, really? I mean, dismiss it just like that? One of the really central experiences of America, not simply for African Americans, but for all Americans. And, that's not very important to the American psyche. Did they mention slavery at all in the original article?
Oh, I'm looking back through it right now to see. In fact, let's just be clever about it and
Control
type in
F.
slavery and see. Not found. Okay, slave. Any slave? No, not found. Okay, so if Safari can't find it, then it must not be there.
Right.
Yeah, that critique was leveled. I think it's a serious one, but there are some ironies here. I mean, they speak approvingly of Tocqueville as one of the few Europeans who actually bothered to do his homework about America and actually visit those crazy Americans, which of course he did. I'm a big Tocqueville fan. I hopefully don't say this too often in blogging heads segments, but one of the themes on which Tocqueville speaks or writes most profoundly is the theme of American slavery and the legacy of slavery. And he's got these aphorisms or maxims in Democracy in America that just speak with ringing truth that persists to this very day, right? He's sort of speaking about the three races that inhabit America, taking the native population as one of them. And he says specifically about black and white Americans, regardless of whether, just sort of setting the slave question aside somewhat to make the racial observation, which I think is, wrapped up with the slave question in an important way that Tocqueville helps us understand. He says, wherever I went in America and I saw, sort of blacks and whites together, they mingled without mixing, I think were his words. Right. And sure enough, here we are today in a supposedly ennobled and enlightened era, where it's true, plenty of progress has been made on race in America, but much of the time, it remains true that blacks and whites mingle without mixing. You might find them together, but it's and we can hark back to the oft-made observation about who goes to which churches on Sunday, right? So it's true that these legacies, these racial legacies, are enduring ones, and they had even started to solidify when Tocqueville was around. Of course, he didn't spend as much time in the South as I wish that he had. There could have been a whole new host of insights there. But gosh, I think there's an even richer story to tell about American exceptionalism that does focus on slavery.
Yeah, you can even take and I thought that sort of in the context of the way people think about American exceptionalism, you can take a very conservative approach to the speech that Obama gave on race. So, his famous speech on race that was supposed to diffuse all the racial tension back in 2008. Where he put the elimination of slavery and the civil rights and the civil rights movement firmly within the context of an American exceptionalist vision, right? Where he said that these and I can't remember the exact words, but he put slavery in the context of this understanding of the United States in which there is this set of freedoms and liberties which is understood and appreciated, but they weren't all at the beginning open to everyone. And yet part of the American story is, and part of the peculiarly, uniquely, and exceptional American story is how these liberties and freedoms have been spread across the entire body politic. From the elimination of slavery to the civil rights movement, all the way down potentially to the elimination of the ADT. And Ponnuru and Lowry could have told a story like that. They could have adopted that kind of language to think about slavery. But to write an entire essay about, a 5,000-word essay, about American exceptionalism and not to think in the context not to think at all about slavery, which has made a tremendous mark. Even if you accept that the mark is complicated, but it's made a tremendous mark upon American political institutions, upon American social life, on basically everything that is American. It's striking. It's really striking that they left this out when they could have included something about it. It would not have been that hard to work slavery into the story that they were telling. And I guess
actually,
this was another reason.
I think there's an interesting way in which that could even be spun into the sorts of critiques of Obama that it seems they want to make. It takes us into territory that we might be uncomfortable with, but for instance, right, would Obama have been able to negotiate the race issue simultaneously using it to his rhetorical advantage and backing away from it in key respects? Were he actually African American in the way that, say, Michelle Obama is, right? Or in the way that Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton or whomever was. I think that a key component of Obama's ability to finesse the race issue as brilliantly as he did is the fact that he's, African in part and American, white American in part, and he didn't bring to the table the same sort of imported or leftover memory of slavery that other African American leaders have brought with them. And his ability to cast himself as black, yet sort of not black at the same time, right? And I'm not I'm not talking about sort of the
right. No, I understand what you're saying.
Genes or blood here, but in terms of like cultural affiliation, right? He was able to tap into race while seeming to transcend race, because he, I would say because he wasn't an indigenous African American,
a descendant of slaves.
Yeah, right. And that that suggests something about a way in which Obama really is unlike African American leaders of yore, or even of the recent past. Ways in which, I don't think it sounds sensational to say this, right? But there is a real way in which Obama is not as American in his blackness as many black Americans,
right?
Who can trace. Can trace the generations back in America for many years.
Right. Well, and this is yeah. Well, I occasionally mention to my classes, if you see a white American and black American, which person is more likely to have had ancestors here during the Revolution, and it's almost certainly the African American by a wide margin, simply because of immigration and so forth.
So in that respect, Obama is kind of a free floater relative to your average African American. No one seems to be pursuing that line of thought in a direction that someone like Lowry and Ponnuru might want to take it in. And of course, I don't want to take this into birther territory, certainly. But if we are sort of thinking in a sophisticated way about Obama and what it means to be American, I do think there is a respect in which he's used race to leverage himself toward a perspective that simultaneously seems to consummate what it means to be an American, but also push past Americanness as the locus of his identity, right? And it's that kind of move that I think really does unsettle and frustrate and disturb conservatives.
Right. No, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for that, and nothing of that came out. Nothing of that was here, and that was disappointing. That was very disappointing to me. I mean, we've talked a lot about this. Are there any other particular avenues that you want to pursue on this, on the idea of American exceptionalism? I guess here's one. Because I was thinking about this, it occurred to me when I was reading this that this song to American exceptionalism could be used to, for example, justify attacks on the metric system, right? Because it's one way in which the United States is exceptional. We don't use the metric system, despite the fact that it's crazy not to use the metric system. Did you get a sense that I mean, I guess I'm reading from a much more partisan point of view than you are. But it struck me that this also was a way to think about American exceptionalism as a preparation for attacks against particular political movements or particular political ideas. One of which would be sort of the almost trivial idea of the metric system, but another would be sort of attacks on the United States Senate or on the filibuster or something like that, which we declare the United States Senate to be an element of American exceptionalism, which it certainly is, because there's nothing even vaguely like the United States Senate in any other country. And then American exceptionalism sort of is a debate ender on this question, right? Rather than debating the merits of the United States Senate from a democratic point of view, a democratic theory point of view, or a efficiency point of view, or anything like that, that it's a debate ender simply to say, well, this is one of the things that makes America exceptional, is the U.S. Senate that works in this, or works, and putting quotes around the word works, in a particular fashion. Did you get this sense at all, or does this make any sense to you?
Yeah, I don't think you're... I think it would make sense in hindsight if that turned out to be the case. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure whether or not American exceptionalism is the trope that you want to rely on to save the filibuster, mm-hmm. right? And I want to save the filibuster, right. And the Electoral College, and a number of very American, kooky in some respects, but in other respects mm-hmm. eminently reasonable institutions. So again, it goes back to this challenge that conservatives face, which is to somehow synthesize the traditionalist wing and the exceptionalist wing mm-hmm. In a way that cashes out not just as a sort of intelligible set of coherent propositions about what America is and where it's going, but as sort of policy positions too. And I do think that the line of critique in the piece that goes after people who aren't Obama but mm-hmm. are just as bad and are harder to criticize because they're not Obama, right? Certain legal theorists who want to streamline American law more in tune with European law. People who are comfortable with importing international law and European law into Supreme Court decisions, right? Things like that. I think that's an argument that has some real teeth. If there's anything that is indicative of the American political identity, it's certain key or foundational laws, legal texts, and the legal traditions that have emanated out of them. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a fair point. Something that's not a fair point, right, is, Obama didn't wear a flag pin, right? What an un-American person. Well, I think there's a good case to be made that that having the convention of having to wear flag pins, which does not have a long tradition in America, is actually indicative of the way that that exuding Americanness has become too difficult, or something that you can do so superficially mm-hmm. That people are falling back on these pins to kind of communicate a message that they then let drop out of their conduct or their speeches or what have you. It becomes an exercise in tokenism. Right. Certainly that's not the kind of demonstration of Americanism that people who agree with Ponnuru and Lowry on the merits should want to see, or at least I would argue.
Right. There was one more point that I wanted to reach, or that I wanted to breach, that is now temporarily escaping me. The mass transit thing. I mean, this may not be the last point, but it's one point that I wanted to touch on. In the response they made to, in their sort of general response to their critics, which is why, by the way, a book that I've always wanted to write, just a response to my critics, is as the title of the book, which I think would be endlessly entertaining to actually write. But anyway, the notion that Americans who favor mass transit not because they would like to ride on mass transit, but because it's European. And they're pretty explicit about this in the response that they make, right? And it evokes an understand, or it's indicative of how they understand what these critics are getting at, right? That these critics are getting at not sort of any particular end state, but that they just want to be more European. On this point, I can comment from personal experience. If there was mass transit between the places that I live and work, and I live in Cincinnati and I work in Lexington, Kentucky, which are about 85 miles apart, I would ride mass transit every single day, and I would read books and so forth, and it would be awesome. And you live in Maryland, is that correct?
I'm in Virginia, actually.
Virginia. Well, you live in an area where there's plenty of mass transit.
Right.
And I have recently lived in Baltimore, and it's fantastic to be able to use the mass transit to D.C. No. I mean, mass transit is great because you don't have to drive, and there is a serious upside to not having to drive. And to think that people like it just because it's European rather than because there's an actual serious personal upside is, again, just something that I find amazingly irritating about their understanding of critics of the United States, right, of critics of U.S. transportation policy. This is all, for me, this has all been very bile-oriented for me. So,
yeah, one of the pitfalls of an article like this, and again, I'm sure I've fallen into the pits on my own on several occasions. When you're taking as wide of a lens as this piece, you can't write thoroughly about everything, and you're trying to synthesize a bunch of small and medium-sized points and connect the dots and come up with this panoramic picture. Mm-hmm. And in some ways it works, and in other ways you're making certain sacrifices. Right. And I think that there is a discussion about the mass transit issue that conservatives in this vein can conduct that does develop this argument in an intelligent way and does basically work within the framework that they set out, however rudimentary. I mean, part of I almost want to say the beating heart of this piece is that America isn't just America, but it's also this basket of commitments and principles and convictions and dispositions that is of America, but it somehow isn't the same as America. Mm-hmm. I think that's fair enough, and we can talk forever about how that works. Mm-hmm. But if that's true, then I think it's safe to say surely the same thing is true more or less about Europe itself, right? And so if Lowry and Ponnuru had the space, perhaps, they could have started to cash that part of the argument out too, which I think is important to things like the mass transit argument. Because, I think it's right that many proponents of mass transit are not just proponents of it because, hey, sometimes it's nice to not drive 300 miles when you have to go 300 miles. Mm-hmm. I concur freely, right? Non-partisan issue. Mm-hmm. But I think at the same time it's true that people who like the way Europe does certain things like the way Europe does those things, not because Europe is Europe, right? But because Europe brings to bear its own basket of commitments and convictions and dispositions that in some way do cohere into an identity, just as America's cohere into its own identity. Right. And Lowry and Ponnuru want to go to bat against Americans who look at the European basket and say, that's a nice basket. We should try to make our basket kind of more like that basket because there are problems with our basket, right? And one of the big picture ideas that goes in the European basket is, I think I'm safe in saying this, oftentimes bureaucratic experts who are empowered to make system level changes in a society will come up with the best answers. And one of those answers that I think is typical of the European approach is again this kind of clean, efficient, well-integrated mass transit system that makes personal transportation property maybe not obsolete, but a lot less valuable and a lot less worthwhile than it is in America. There is a way in which proponents of mass transit in America are drawing on the European experience in a way that reaches, I think, deeper than just the practical benefits of mass transit. Again, this is an argument that has to play out itself over several paragraphs, or in this case, one giant monologue. And it's an argument that Lowry and Ponnuru don't get to make, And it's unfortunate because then it inspires people on your side to say, you're just being silly. Who doesn't like to read? I mean, don't conservatives like to read on trains while seeing America's grandeur roll by outside, right? There's manifest destiny for you. Take the Amtrak from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco or whatever.
Right. And I guess that I'm concerned that this is not just an issue of space, but rather an issue of interest. When I read this article, I didn't see it as trying to make a series of interesting analytical points. I saw it as trying to set up trying to create a framework under which certain ideas could be declared alien and therefore unacceptable. Which I should hasten to add is not something which I think is inevitable to conservative writing, but that I think is evident here, and that I think was the major purpose here, right, was simply to declare the ineligibility of certain concepts and certain ideas in American political discourse. But anyway, I mean, I don't have much more. Do you have?
Well, we're hitting the 45-minute mark, so I think my final word on the matter would be that in some respects this piece seems like a conversation stopper, but in other respects here we are having what, at least to me, has been a very enjoyable conversation emanating from its claims and the way in which they're made. So kudos to more of that conversation taking place. I will say that, if I wanted to go after Obama in a way that compared or contrasted his domestic agenda or his domestic approach with his foreign policy approach or his foreign policy agenda, I would say that I'm much more worried about what Obama is doing to America domestically than what he's doing to America as a sort of a nation on the world stage. I'm more concerned with the way Obama is using America as it is on its own terms to create transformational, irreversible changes for the bad, for the ill. Then I am concerned that he's using America as America's international identity to reshape America at home. When I look at sort of what Obama's doing on foreign policy, I've got complaints. I've got big complaints with his France policy, for instance. But, I basically support his policy on Afghanistan. I basically support his policy on Iraq. I basically support his policy on, India. It could be more robust, but basically support it. I've been willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on Iran. That might have to change soon. He might change. I don't know. Hillary Clinton has her own opinions on this sort of thing. Probably, as far as I'm concerned, the best way to go after Obama as someone who's fundamentally changing the American character is to focus on what he's doing domestically rather than to try to couple it to this this much more complex argument, I think, about how he's shifting America's place in the world.
Right. And I think that, for example, his Nobel Prize speech is primarily an American exceptionalist document, and it should be understood as such. And it should be understood as such in the context of the American audience, right? That he was trying to make an American exceptionalist audience argument. Well, no, I mean to both an American audience and to a foreign audience, and so the domestic context is more important in thinking about Obama's transformational appeal. But anyway, it's been a fantastic conversation. This has been very interesting, despite what I feel was the subject matter was inadequate, but that's fine. So it was good talking to you.
Likewise. Let's do this again sometime.
All right.
Great.